It was the third day of the storm when I noticed the footprints. Thick snow blanketed everything around my isolated cabin, erasing all signs of the world beyond. The radio buzzed with static. The roads were buried under drifts taller than my truck, and I hadn't seen another soul in days. I welcomed the solitude at first. I needed the break, a week off grid to unwind, write, and forget the chaos of city life. But on that morning, standing at the front door with a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hand, I saw something that didn't make sense. A single line of footprints stretched from the edge of the woods to my porch steps. They were human, unmistakably, barefoot, no shoes, no boots, just pale impressions of toes and heels pressed deep into the fresh snow. I stood there for a long while staring at them, my breath fogging up the glass of the front door. The trail stopped at the porch and went no further. No return path, no animal tracks, nothing but that one perfect line of prints. At first, I convinced myself it was a trick of the wind. Maybe an animal, oddly shaped paws. Maybe melting had distorted them. But that was just me trying to explain away something that made my skin crawl. I bundled up, stepped outside, and followed the tracks to the edge of the trees. They just ended there, as if the person had emerged from thin air and walked directly to my door. I searched the woods, calling out, feeling ridiculous for doing so. Nothing but silence and snow greeted me. No rustling, no reply. Just the trees, bent under the weight of ice, groaning softly in the wind. I returned to the cabin and tried to brush it off, but the thought lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old timber felt louder. The wind tapped against the windows like fingers. And once, just once, I swore. I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate. I grabbed the rifle from the wall, crept to the front door, and flung it open. Nothing. Just the snow, falling harder now. But the next morning, the footprints were back. They started again from the edge of the woods and ended right at my door. Fresh, distinct. Again, only one set. Again, no return path. And this time, they were closer. Not just to the steps, but right up to the front door itself, to the threshold, to the place where I had stood the day before, watching them with disbelief. I didn't go outside this time. Something in my chest tightened, a deep animal fear I hadn't felt since childhood. I kept the lights on all day, every curtain drawn back so I could see every inch of snow around the house. I listened constantly, head tilted toward the windows, the hum of silence broken only by gusts of wind or the pop of wood in the fireplace. That night, it started again. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard it. 3 soft knocks on the front door. I froze. The dish slipped from my hands and shattered in the sink. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Then I crept toward the door, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. I peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one. Just snow falling steadily beneath the porch light. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door this time. The next morning, there were new footprints. Not only were they at my door again, they were on the porch, leading up to the window beside the couch. I found smudges on the glass, faint and finger-like, as if someone had pressed their face there during the night. I wanted to leave, to pack my things and get in the truck, but the road was impassable. Snow was piled so high I'd need a plow just to move the truck a few feet. I was trapped, and something or someone was here with me. That night, the knocking came again. Not just from the front door this time, but from the back. Then, the windows. Soft, tapping sounds in a slow rhythm, one after the other. I huddled in the corner with the rifle across my lap, all the lights off, trying not to breathe. The tapping continued for hours, always moving, always circling. I didn't sleep. I don't think I even blinked. When the gray morning came, I dared to. I checked every window, every door, and then I saw it. A new set of footprints, inside. They started at the front door and led down the hallway toward my bedroom. I don't know how long I stood there staring at them. Minutes, maybe hours. My hands shook as I followed them. The prints were wet, melting slightly into the wooden floorboard. I followed them to my bedroom door. It was open. I hadn't left it. The room was empty, but the sheets on the bed were pulled back. The pillow indented, as if someone had lain there beside me all night. I'm writing this now from the kitchen. Every light in the house is on. I haven't slept. I don't dare to. The prints are still there, slowly fading as the warmth of the cabin dries them out. But I can feel it. Something is watching me. Something came out of that storm. And it's not done with me, because I just heard it again. 3 soft knocks, not from the door, from inside the house. It started with a power outage. The wind had been howling for hours, pressing against the walls of the house like it wanted to come inside. I was staying at my grandparents' old place, an ancient 2-story farmhouse tucked deep in the valley, surrounded by forest and fields, with the nearest neighbor miles away. They'd passed years ago, and the house sat empty most of the time. but I liked escaping there when life got too loud. No cell service, no traffic, just silence and snow. I had arrived the day before the storm hit. The forecast said a blizzard was coming, but I didn't care. I thought I'd hunker down, light some fires, read a few books, and enjoy the solitude. But the storm was worse than predicted. Sheets of snow, winds like a freight train, and biting cold that seemed to creep into the house, no matter how tightly I sealed the windows. The power flickered all day. I had candles ready, but nothing prepares you for the kind of darkness that comes in a snowstorm, when even the moonlight disappears behind clouds, and the windows turn to mirrors reflecting only your own face. When the power finally gave out that evening, I lit the candles and built a fire in the old stone fireplace. The flames cast long shadows across the room, and everything felt just a little bit more fragile. I kept telling myself it was fine. Just weather, just winter, just a little isolation-induced anxiety. But then I heard the knocking. At first, it was faint. I thought it was the wind again, rattling a shutter or a branch hitting the siding. But as I sat by the fire, listening closely, it became rhythmic, deliberate. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I stood and went to the front door, holding a candle out in front of me. The glass in the door was fogged, but I didn't see anything. I opened it anyway, peering out into the snowstorm. Nothing. Just a wall of white and the echo of wind screaming through the trees. I closed the door, locked it, and chalked it up to my imagination. But a few hours later, it happened again. 3 knocks. Only this time, it came from the back door. That door hadn't been opened in years. The porch beyond it was half collapsed, buried under snowdrifts. No one could have made it around there. I tried to tell myself it was just shifting wood or a tree limb falling against the wall, but something about the sound was too precise. I didn't open the door this time. I just stood there, hand on the knob, listening. I waited for another knock, but it didn't come. Then, the scraping started. It came from upstairs, a long, dragging sound, like someone was pulling something heavy across the floor of the second story. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. There was nothing up there, just the old bedrooms. I hadn't even gone upstairs since arriving. I had no reason to. But now, something was up there. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me not to. But something about that sound, slow, methodical, almost lazy, drew me in. I took the candle and climbed the stairs, each creaking step amplifying the tension in my chest. The scraping had stopped by the time I reached the landing. I looked down the narrow hallway, doors closed, shadows flickering. I opened the first room, my grandmother's old sewing room, empty, just dust and cobwebs. The next room, my grandfather's study, same thing, nothing out of place. Then I opened the guest room door, and I froze. There, in the middle of the floor, was an old rocking chair, one I didn't recognize. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it, and it was swaying gently, as if someone had just gotten out of it. I stared at it, the air growing colder by the second. My breath began to fog. I backed out slowly and shut the door. I went back downstairs and stoked the fire, trying to convince myself just tired, that maybe the chair had always been there, just forgot, that it was just a draft, that nothing was wrong. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. When I finally dozed off on the couch, I dreamt of the rocking, of someone sitting in it, staring at the hallway door, waiting. I woke up to more knocking, this time from the windows, all of them. It wasn't loud, it was soft, rapid tapping, like fingernails against glass. I ran from window to window, peering out into the storm. But every window was empty, just wind and snow. Then I looked at the footprints. They were everywhere, dozens of, surrounding the house, bare feet, like someone had walked through the snow barefoot in the middle of a blizzard. Some were pressed right against the glass, as if someone had been standing there watching me while I slept. I backed away from the window, my heart in my throat. That's when I heard it again, upstairs, the rocking chair, creaking, back and forth. I couldn't breathe. Something was in the house. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept up the stairs again, the flickering candle barely pushing back the darkness. The cold was overwhelming, as if the air itself had frozen. I reached the guest room, hand trembling, and opened the door. The chair was empty, but the bed was pulled back, and the sheets were soaked, not with water, but with blood. There was a single word scrawled across the wall above the bed. It looked smeared with fingers. Welcome. I ran. I didn't think. I just bolted. I threw on my coat, grabbed my keys, and fought my way through waist-deep snow to the truck. I didn't care about the roads. I didn't care about the storm. I drove until I hit the highway, until I saw lights, until I could breathe again. I never went back. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was knocking. But I know it wasn't human, and I know it's still there. Because last week I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no message inside, just a photo of the rocking chair. And behind it, barely visible in the shadows, a figure watching me. I never liked Snowstorm, but that night sealed it for me forever. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and my dog Max, up in the remote mountain cabin my late uncle left. A rustic little place, surrounded by dense woods, with a wood-burning stove and a breathtaking view of the snow-covered valley. No neighbors, no signal, and miles of winding road between me and the nearest town. I thought it would be good for me. I'd been feeling burned out. City life had gotten under my skin, so I packed some food, extra firewood, a couple of books, and planned for 3 quiet days of reading, hiking, and just breathing. But the snow came early. It started just after sunset, soft flurries drifting gently through the pine tree. I actually smiled at first. It felt cinematic, peaceful. I stoked the fire, gave Max a treat, and settled in with a hot drink. Then, the wind picked up, fast. The temperature dropped like a stone, and the snow didn't stop. By the time I went to bed, the windows were already half covered in drifts, and the wind was howling like a wounded animal outside. I slept lightly, and sometime deep into the night, Max started growling, low and steady. I sat up in bed, disoriented. The fire had burned low, casting just faint glows across the cabin walls. Max was sitting at the door, ears perked, teeth bared. I whispered his name, but he didn't move. His growl deepened. Then I heard it, crunching, outside, slow, deliberate steps in the snow. At first I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, maybe a bear, but the steps didn't sound like an animal. They were spaced too perfectly, too slowly, like someone was walking around the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I couldn't see much, just the swirling snow and vague outlines of trees. Then something moved, just beyond the tree line. A figure, tall, thin, standing motionless between 2 pines, half shrouded in snow. I squinted, trying to make out any detail, but my light wasn't strong enough to reach that far. And then it vanished, just gone, like it melted into the trees. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a tree swaying, maybe my imagination, but I couldn't sleep after that. Neither could Max. He paced all night, growling softly every few minutes. By morning, the storm had worsened. I was snowed in completely. The truck was buried, the road invisible. I tried to call for help, but of course, no signal. I tried to brush it off and make the best of it. Made breakfast, threw another log on the fire, tried reading. But I kept feeling watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see that figure again. By late afternoon, I saw something in the snow that made my blood go cold. Footprints, a single trail, leading from the edge of the woods to the cabin and circling it. Bare feet, not boots, not animal tracks, bare human footprints. And they were deep, fresh. Someone had been walking around my cabin in the middle of a blizzard, barefoot. I followed the trail with my eyes, and something else caught my attention. A symbol, etched into the snow on the cabin's side wall. A crude, spiral-like mark, almost like a distorted eye. I hadn't seen it the night before. It hadn't been there. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Not just fear. This was something deeper, something primal. That night was worse. The knocking started around midnight, not on the doors, on the walls, soft, irregular tapping, like fingers drumming gently on wood. Sometimes near the floor, sometimes just beneath the windowsill, like it was testing, looking for a way in. I stayed up with Max beside the fire, flashlight in hand, heart pounding every time the tapping moved to a new spot. And then the whispers began, barely audible, just beneath the wind. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm, like someone speaking right outside, hushed and urgent. I wanted to believe it was just wind slicing through cracks in the wood, but I could feel the cadence. It wasn't natural. Max barked suddenly and bolted toward the front door, snarling. I followed with the flashlight, yanked the door open, expecting to scare off whatever was there. But there was nothing. No tracks, no figure, no sound, just the wind. But when I turned to come back inside, something was waiting in the doorway. Not a person, not quite. A shape, tall and impossibly thin. Its arms too long, its neck crooked, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, I still don't have the words. It wasn't a face in the way you think of faces. It was like stretched skin and voids, where features should have been. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, inches from the threshold. I slammed the door in its face and threw the latch. I stayed by that door all night with Max at my side, both of us shaking. I didn't sleep, just waited for the thing to try again. But it never knocked. It didn't have to. At dawn, I found something inside. In the kitchen, on the counter I'd cleaned just the night before, was a new symbol. That same spiral-like eye scratched deep into the wood, and beneath it, written in ash from the fireplace, "You opened it." I don't know what that means. I don't know what it was. All I know is when I finally got out 2 days later, I sold the cabin. I never went back. And ever since that night, sometimes, on cold, snowy evenings when the wind is high, Max still growls at nothing. And sometimes, when I pass a fogged window or a reflective surface, I see that spiral. I never believed isolation could warp your mind until the snowstorm and what happened in that house. It was my sister's vacation rental, a secluded chalet-style home tucked deep in the hills, surrounded by towering pines. She had planned a weekend retreat for herself and her friends, but had to cancel last minute. She offered me the place instead, thinking I could use the solitude after a rough breakup. I agreed, figuring a few days away from everything might help clear my head. I arrived just before the first snowflakes started to fall. The house was beautiful, wooden beams, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a fireplace that gave off a comforting warmth. There was no cell service, but the place had electricity, stocked shelves, and a weather radio. It felt safe. That first night, I stayed near the fire, reading and listening to the storm intensify outside. Wind howled like something alive, and snow slammed against the windows like icy fists. Still, inside, it was cozy. But then I found the door. It was in the basement, tucked behind a storage shelf full of firewood. I hadn't noticed it when I first explored the house. It was strange. Old, rotting, and heavy, with a rusted latch and no hand, just a narrow gap beneath it where cold air leaked through. I tried the latch, but it wouldn't budge. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I figured it led to an old root cellar or crawl space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't supposed to be there. That night, I dreamed of knocking, faint at first, then louder, urgent pounding echoing through the house. I jolted awake, heart racing. Max, my sister's dog I'd agreed to bring along, was whining, tail between his legs, staring at the basement door. It was silent again, just the storm outside. But I swear the cold draft had grown stronger. I could feel it even upstairs now, creeping into my bones. The next morning, I went back to check the door, and the latch was open. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to rationalize. Maybe it had been weak. Maybe the storm loosened it somehow. But that didn't explain the smell. Damp, musty, like rotting wood and something else. Something sour and old, like decay. I opened the door. It led to a narrow stairwell carved into stone, much older than the house above. The walls were wet, with strange dark patches along the stone. The stairs descended farther than they should have, far deeper than the house's foundation should allow. I didn't go far, just a few steps, but I swear, I heard something breathing down there. Not wind, not echoes, breathing. I shut the door and latched it. That night, the whispers started. They came from beneath the floorboard, murmured words in a language I didn't understand, wet, slurred syllables like someone speaking through water. Max wouldn't go near the basement. He cowered under the table and whimpered until morning. I tried not to lose it, told myself I was tired, paranoid, stressed from everything. But then things moved. Chairs were subtly out of place. The mirror in the hallway had a crack that wasn't there before. And the smell, oh God, the smell was worse, like something dead seeping through the wood itself. Then I found the writing. On the window pane, drawn in condensation, "You let it out." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't my handwriting. I hadn't seen anyone. No one should have been able to reach that window from outside, not without leaving footprints in the snow. But there were no prints, just that message. And then the basement door opened again. I didn't hear it this time. I only noticed when Max started barking frantically, running in circles and clawing at the front door. I followed him to the basement and found the door wide open, the dark stairwell yawning beneath like a throat ready to swallow. From the bottom of the stairs, something moved. Not quickly, not clumsily. Smooth, slow, deliberate. A shape, tall, skeletal, crawling like a spider, but with arms too long, fingers like twigs curling against the stone steps. Its skin was pale gray, damp and cracked, like it had been buried for decades. I slammed the door and pushed the shelf in front of it. I didn't sleep. I just sat by the front door, holding the fireplace poker, heart racing. The next morning, the shelf was pushed aside again. The basement door was open again, but this time, there were handprints, hundreds of them, all over the walls, the floor, the ceiling, tiny handprints, child-sized, in soot or ash, each one facing inward, toward the door, like something had been trapped down there for a long time. And now it wasn't. I left the house immediately. I trudged through waist-deep snow for miles until a snowplow driver finally picked me up near the main road. I never went back. A week later, my sister got a call from the rental company. They said something strange had happened. A maintenance worker went to check the house after the storm. He never came out. They found his body near the basement, face frozen in a scream, eyes missing, and every mirror in the house shattered. They sealed the place up after that. No one rents it. But sometimes I still dream of that stairwell, of something crawling up it slowly, whispering in that thick, gurgling voice. And in the frost on my apartment window last night, I swear I saw a handprint. I was always drawn to solitude, quiet, remote places where the noise of life couldn't reach me. That's probably why I accepted the caretaker job at the old lodge, nestled in the mountain. It was closed for the season, buried under a snowstorm that cut it off from the nearest town. My only duty was to maintain the place, make rounds, and keep the generators running until the owners returned in spring. A dream job, I thought, but I didn't know what I'd be sharing that lodge with. The building was massive, 4 stories of creaking wood, endless hallways, and dust-covered rooms. Most were locked and unused, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. The lodge had a history. Locals said it used to be a boarding school in the 1930s, but it shut down after a fire. Half the original structure was rebuilt, and over time, the stories of the fire faded into whispers. The snow started the night I arrived. By the second day, the drifts were so high I couldn't even see the driveway. I didn't mind. I lit the fireplaces, settled into the caretaker's room, and started cataloging maintenance tasks. The lodge creaked and groaned constantly in the wind. Just old bones settling, I told myself. But then I found the bell. It was an old brass bell hanging in the main hallway, something I hadn't noticed at first. When I asked the owner about it in one of our check-in calls, he seemed surprised. I didn't know there was a bell in the lodge, and he said, we never installed one. I thought maybe it had been left from the original school. Maybe a morning bell, but it rang on its own at night, always at 3:12 a.m., a deep metallic clang that echoed through the halls. I checked it the first time, thinking wind had knocked something loose, but it was mounted tight, the clapper still swinging when I arrived. Then, I heard the footsteps. That same night after the bell rang, I heard soft steps echoing from the floor above, measured, deliberate. I went up with a flashlight expecting to find snow damage or maybe even an animal that had gotten in, but the hallway was empty. All the doors were still locked, nothing disturbed, except the faint smell of something burnt, like scorched fabric or hair. I tried to ignore it, rationalize it, but every night the pattern continued. 3:12 a.m., the bell would ring. 3:14 a.m., footsteps above. 3:16 a.m., a door would creak open, and by morning things had changed. Pictures in the hallway would be tilted. One morning I found an old school desk in the middle of the lobby, dusty and cracked, with a child's name scratched into the top. Emily. I hadn't seen that desk before. It wasn't there the day prior. By the end of the first week, I started hearing whispers, children's voices echoing faintly behind the walls, sometimes laughter, sometimes crying, sometimes both. I started sleeping with the lights on. One night, after the bell rang, I went to the second floor with a fire axe. I was done being. I was going to find the source. But the moment I stepped onto the hallway, I heard a voice, clear, right behind me. Why didn't you help us? I turned. Nothing. But every door on the floor slammed shut at once. I ran back down, locked myself in the caretaker's room. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat there listening to the sounds above, the dragging footsteps, a child's soft sobbing, and at one point, the unmistakable sound of scratching on my door. The next morning, I found burned handprints all over the lodge's walls, small, child-sized palms smeared in black soot, some dragging down the walls like someone had clawed their way along them. I called the owner again, panicked. He told me something that chilled me to the core. I didn't want to scare you, but there was a fire in the old school. It started in the second-floor dormitory. The doors jammed shut, the children couldn't get out. He paused. They say one of them rang the bell, trying to alert someone. That bell was torn down years ago after the rebuild. But it's here. I see it every day. There was silence on the line. Then it wasn't put there by us, he said quietly. And you should leave. I didn't wait. I packed a bag and tried to get out, but the snow had buried the path entirely. I was trapped. That final night, the bell didn't ring at 3:12. It rang at midnight. Every door in the lodge opened at once. The power flickered and went out completely. And in the dark, I saw them. Children. Burned, blackened, eyes hollow with soot and ash. They filled the hallway, standing still, silent, except for one girl in front. Emily. She stared at me. Her lips moved, mouthing the same words I'd heard before. Why didn't you help us? I backed into the caretaker's room, but it was too late. The smell of fire was everywhere. The walls felt hot. The wood began to blacken and char before my eyes. And then I woke up outside, buried in snow, half frozen, barely breathing. A rescue team found me days later after a distress call was picked up, though I don't remember making one. They said the lodge had been untouched. No signs of fire, no damage, no burned handprints. But the bell is still there. I saw it myself before I left. Still hanging, still swinging slightly, still waiting for 3:12 a.m. It had been years since I'd seen my brother Jason. Life had taken us down different roads. He chose a quiet life in the countryside, while I stayed tangled in the chaos of the city. We'd occasionally exchange texts or a brief call, but that was it. So, when he invited me to his remote cabin deep in the mountains for a winter getaway, I took it as a rare chance to reconnect. I didn't expect much, just a few beers by the fireplace, old memories, and a heavy snowfall outside. But I wasn't prepared for how strange he had become, or what really lived in that forest. The drive there was beautiful, thick pine trees coated in snow, winding roads so serene it almost felt like a dream. When I pulled into his property, Jason was already waiting on the porch, waving. But something felt off immediately. He looked thinner, paler. His eyes seemed sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "You okay?" I asked, handing him a hug that he returned half-heartedly. "Yeah," he said. "Just tired. Storm's been rough." That storm. It started that night and didn't let up for the next 5 days. The snow piled high, burying the trail I'd driven in on. We were completely cut off from civilization, and the old radio Jason kept in the cabin barely picked up anything except static. Still, I didn't mind at first. The fireplace crackled, we cooked warm meals, and talked about our childhood. But something always pulled his attention away. He kept glancing out the windows, especially at night, staring into the snow-covered woods like he was expecting something or someone. On the second night, I caught him outside at 2 a.m., barefoot in the snow, looking into the trees. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I shouted, dragging him back in. "They're watching," he mumbled, shivering. "They always watch." I thought he was sleepwalking, maybe stressed. But his behavior got worse. He started leaving strange marks on the windows, symbols drawn with ash from the fireplace. He nailed old pieces of wood to the doorframes, whispering words I didn't understand. When I asked, he told me not to speak their name, that they only came in storms. That's when I started hearing things too. Whispers. Sometimes they came from the trees, sometimes from beneath the floorboards. They weren't voices I could clearly identify, just faint murmuring sounds like someone speaking in a forgotten language. Sometimes laughter, sometimes crying. One night, I heard someone tapping on the window right next to my bed. When I looked, there were no footprints in the snow. Jason insisted we had to stay inside after dark. "Don't open the doors," he said, "no matter what you hear." That night I heard my mother's voice calling me. She's been dead for 7 years. It came from outside, gentle and familiar. "Come here, sweetheart," she said over and over, just like she used to when I was little. I almost opened the door before Jason tackled me away from it. "That's not her," he screamed. "That's how they get in." He showed me an old journal the next morning, weathered, half-burnt pages filled with frantic handwriting, some his, some older. It spoke of the snow watchers, ancient spirits bound to the woods, awakened by storms, drawn to isolation. They mimic voices, lure people into the snow, and once you see them, they never leave you alone. Jason claimed he had seen one when he first moved here, a tall, pale figure standing between the trees. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. "And now they watch me every night," he said. By the 4th day, Jason was gone. I woke up to find his bed empty, the door wide open, snow blown into the cabin. His footprints disappeared into the woods. I followed them, screaming his name, but the snow swallowed everything. No trail, no sounds, just the wind. And then I saw it, a figure standing far beyond the tree line, tall, motionless, its face pale and stretched, like a blank mask. It didn't move, didn't blink. I felt this pull, like gravity itself wanted me to walk toward it. But I ran instead. I locked myself in the cabin and waited. That night, the knocking came again. Not gentle taps. This time, it was pounding. Violent, furious, shaking the door. I barricaded everything, clutching a knife, but the sound didn't stop. I could hear footsteps on the roof, scratching along the walls, the sound of voices echoing from the chimney. My brother's voice, my mother's, even my own. When dawn came, the noise stopped. I stepped outside into the silence. No prints, no signs of anything. I packed what I could and began hiking toward the nearest town, abandoning my car, my brother, everything. They found me 3 days later, delirious and frostbitten. I told the rescue team everything. They didn't believe me, of course, said Jason probably wandered off and froze, but when they searched the cabin, they found the symbols on the windows, the journal, and one thing that didn't belong, a handprint on the mirror in the cabin's bathroom. Not Jason's, not mine. It was too long, too slender, like something not quite human had touched it from the inside. Now, I hear tapping on my apartment windows during storms. I live on the 10th floor. I hadn't planned to spend the winter at my uncle's old property. It was supposed to be a brief stop, a few days at most, just long enough to collect some documents and assess the place for sale. But when the snowstorm hit earlier than expected, I found myself stranded in a dilapidated 2-story house in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and white silence. I remembered the place vaguely from childhood visits. The structure was crooked now, the roof sagging under years of neglect. But the furnace still worked, and I had enough food to last a few days. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable until the knocking began. The first night was uneventful, save for the howling wind outside and the occasional groan of the old wood settling. It was the second night when I heard the sound. A knock, soft but deliberate, on the front door at exactly 3:17 a.m. I froze. No one should have been out there. I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived, and the road had been buried under at least 3 feet of snow. I waited, thinking maybe I imagined it. Then came the second knock. This one was louder, followed by another. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I approached the door cautiously, heart pounding, and looked through the peephole. Nothing, just darkness and snow. I opened it anyway. I don't know why. I guess I needed to confirm there was no one there. The porch was empty, no footprints, no movement. I closed the door, bolted it, and tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a tree branch, maybe the wind. But deep down, I knew better. That knock had rhythm, intention. The next day, I tried to distract myself with cleaning and taking inventory of the place. In the attic, I found a box of my uncle's belongings, old photos, yellowed notebooks, newspaper clippings. One article caught my attention. Local hunter disappears in storm. Only blood-soaked snow found. It was dated 15 years ago, and the name was familiar. It was a neighbor my uncle used to talk about, a man named Harold, who lived just down the ridge. The article said Harold vanished after leaving his house to investigate a sound outside. That night, the knocking came again. 3:17 a.m. 3 knocks, pause, then a fourth. That wasn't what had happened the night before. This time, the knocks were closer together, more urgent. I didn't open the door. But when I turned around, I noticed something that hadn't been there earlier. A wet trail on the floor, as if something had walked through melted snow and tracked it inside. I followed the trail down the hallway and found it ended in the living room. But there was no source. The door had been locked, the windows shut tight, yet something had come inside. I stayed up until daylight, lights on, knife in hand. I told myself I'd leave as soon as the storm passed, even if I had to hike out on foot. But by the next afternoon, the snow had piled so high it was impossible. I couldn't even see the tops of the fence posts anymore. That night, something whispered to me. I was half asleep when I heard it. Soft, raspy, right beside my ear. A voice I didn't recognize. "Let me in!" I jolted upright, gasping. Nothing was there, but the knocking started again. This time, from the back door. I rushed to the kitchen, my legs shaking, and peered through the window, and that's when I saw the figure. A silhouette, tall and narrow, standing just beyond the tree line. I couldn't make out the details through the swirling snow, but it stood perfectly still, facing the house. I backed away slowly, then heard something even worse. Footsteps upstairs. I hadn't gone upstairs since earlier that morning, and I knew there was no one else inside. I grabbed the knife again, climbed the stairs step by step, each creak of the floorboards making my skin crawl. The hallway was empty. The bedroom doors were all closed. I checked each room. Nothing. But in the last one, the old guest room, I found the window wide open, snow blowing in. And carved into the frost on the glass were 3 words, "I am here." I slammed the window shut and pushed a dresser against it. I stayed up again, but this time, I started reading through my uncle's journals. He had written about the knocking, too, about the thing that came during snowstorms, wearing the faces of people it had taken, a creature older than the woods themselves, feeding on isolation and fear. He called it the frost veil. According to him, it never comes all at once. It tests you first, knocks, whispers, leaves clues. And once you acknowledge it, once you fear it, it starts to show itself. It feeds off the fear, becomes stronger with every thought you give it, and worst of all, it never leaves a place once it's been invited in. The knocking became constant after that, day and night, on all sides of the house, the attic, the basement, even inside the walls. And then the voices started changing. It wasn't just whispers, it was people I knew. My father's voice, my childhood friend. They'd call out to me, beg me to come outside, tell me there was someone hurt in the woods, ask me to open the door. I didn't, but I made one mistake. One morning, desperate for fresh air, I cracked a window open, just an inch, just for a second. That was all it needed. Now I hear footsteps. I feel something breathing near me when I try to sleep. The knocking doesn't stop. It never stops. And every mirror in the house shows me something I don't recognize, a version of myself with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. I don't know how long time feels distorted now. I see shadows move where there's no light. I speak to things I know aren't real. But worst of all, I think I knocked last night. It started with a weather alert on my phone, just a typical snowstorm warning, nothing unusual for our mountain town. I was house sitting for my friend Alice while she visited her parents in the city. Her cabin sat deep in the woods, nestled in a valley where the snow came heavy and fast, and the roads turned to traps if you didn't leave before the flurries stuck. I figured I'd be fine. The cabin had a fireplace, food, good Wi-Fi, and a panoramic view of the snow-draped forest. It was peaceful, even beautiful, until the snowstorm arrived 3 days early. By the second night, it was a whiteout. I couldn't even see the trees outside. The wind howled, shaking the windows, and the snow piled up halfway across the glass panes. I wasn't scared yet, just annoyed and a bit anxious about getting snowed in. Then, I noticed something strange. There was a trail of footprints outside the back door. At first, I assumed it was mine, maybe from earlier when I brought in firewood. But I checked the boots I'd used. They were still by the door, untouched and dry. I hadn't gone out since yesterday afternoon, and the snowfall since then would have covered any prints. Yet, there they were, clear as day, a single set of prints leading up to the door, but not away from it. I locked every door and window that night. I even shoved furniture in front of the back door just in case. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal anymore. The storm had knocked out reception, and the internet was dead too. The next morning, the footprints were gone, buried by snow, but something worse took their place. On the glass door, drawn in condensation from inside, were 4 finger streaks, like someone had pressed their hand to the glass in the night. But I had been in the living room. No one had gone near the door. I tried to stay rational. Maybe I'd brushed against the door and not realized. Maybe I'd dreamed it. But by that evening, I began hearing things. Subtle creaks upstairs, faint tapping on the walls, floorboards groaning under visible weight. And then I found the mirror. It was hidden behind a heavy curtain in one of the guest bedrooms. I hadn't noticed it before because Alice had warned me not to use that room. Drafty window, she'd said. But curiosity got the better of me. The mirror was old, ornate, with a frame of blackened wood carved in strange, twisting patterns. But the reflection, it wasn't right. When I looked in, it was me, but not quite. My expression was off, my eyes slightly too wide, my smile a bit too stretched. I waved my hand. My reflection waved a moment too late. I shut the curtain and left the room. I didn't go back in. That night, I heard footsteps again, but this time they were inside. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps walking across the hallway upstairs. I stared at the ceiling from the couch, holding my breath, praying it was just the house shifting. Then, a soft knock came from the bedroom door upstairs, the one with the mirror. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, staring at the staircase, knife in hand. The next morning, I found a message on the wall, etched into the frost on the window pane. Let me out. Not let me in, let me out. Something inside that house wanted out. The reflection. I went back to the mirror, thinking I'd gone mad. But when I opened the curtain again, the reflection didn't mimic me. It stood there, motionless, staring with eyes that no longer matched mine. It mouthed something, slow and deliberate. It said, "You're not alone." I slammed the curtain shut again. I wanted to leave, but the snow had blocked every door. I tried to shovel it, dig my way out, but it was like the snow refilled faster than I could move it, like it was trying to keep me inside. That night, I boarded up the guest room door. I piled furniture in front of it and locked myself in the living room. But around midnight, I heard it again, scraping like nails on glass. When I turned to look at the large front window, I saw something pressed against the outside, a figure with my face. It grinned, it knocked once, then vanished. Now every mirror in the house shows a different version of it. Angry, laughing, crying, screaming silently. One of them banged its fists against the glass so violently I thought the mirror would break. I don't know what it is, some kind of doppelganger, a reflection, something born from isolation and cold. But it's getting stronger, more real. It whispers to me, even without the mirrors. I found another message etched in the bathroom, only one, and when I looked up, I wasn't the one staring back anymore. I'd always loved snowstorms. Growing up in Minnesota, I'd romanticized the way everything turned white and still, like the world had pressed pause. That's why I didn't hesitate when my friend Jared invited me to join him at his family's remote winter cabin for a long weekend. He said it was peaceful, tucked away deep in the northern woods, and perfect for getting away from the chaos of city life. I didn't ask many questions. I just packed a bag and went. The storm hit on the second night. At first, it was cozy. Crackling fireplace, thick blankets, hot cocoa, and the wind howling outside while we played board games and told old stories. But sometime after midnight, the mood shifted. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind picked up until the entire cabin groaned and creaked like it was about to collapse. Then we heard something strange. It wasn't the wind, it was rhythmic, a dragging sound across the front porch, slow and deliberate. Jared paused mid-sentence, looked at me, then toward the door. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. I nodded. We both stood up and tiptoed toward the front window. The snow was falling so heavily we could barely see anything, but the porch light flickered enough to illuminate faint movement. Just for a second, something tall was standing at the edge of the porch, unmoving, watching. Probably a moose, Jared muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. Or a bear. But it didn't move like an animal. It didn't move at all. Eventually, it faded into the snow, like it dissolved into the storm. We tried to forget it, told ourselves it was our eyes playing tricks. But that night, just after we got into our separate rooms, I heard a knock. Not at the door, but on the window beside my bed. 3 slow knocks. I froze. We were on the second floor. There was no overhang, no balcony, nothing that would allow anyone to reach that high. I didn't look. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child and waited for the sun. In the morning, I checked the window. Nothing was there. But there were marks, long, smeared streaks on the glass, like someone had dragged their fingers across it from the outside. 4 parallel lines, almost claw-like. Jared seemed shaken too, though he wouldn't admit it. Said he didn't sleep much either. He suggested we pack up and leave early, but the snow was too thick. The car wouldn't start. We were stuck. That evening, the power went out. We lit candles and huddled in the living room, trying to keep the fire going. That's when I noticed Jared was acting strange, jumpy, distant. He kept glancing toward the window as if expecting something. Eventually, he said something that chilled me. "It's following us." I asked what he meant, and he told me a story, one his grandfather used to tell him when he was a kid, about a spirit in the woods, something that moved with the storms, a tall, thin figure in tattered furs that roamed during blizzard, knocking on windows and doors, trying to get inside. It would mimic voices, scratch at walls, and whisper your name in the wind. "If you let it in, it takes your place," he said, "and no one ever notices." I tried to laugh it off, but his expression was dead serious. That night I heard it again, the knock, but this time it was followed by a voice. "Let me in. It's cold." It was my voice. I didn't respond. I sat against the door with my back pressed to it, heart racing, knife in hand. Jared didn't come out of his room the next morning. I knocked, called his name, but there was no response. Eventually, I forced the door open, and he was gone. His clothes were still there, his phone, his wallet, but he was nowhere to be found. No footprints outside, no signs of struggle, just an open window, blowing cold air into the room. And something else. Scratched into the wooden floor beside the bed were the words, "It's inside now." I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. The snow was too high. I tried everything, digging out the car, calling for help, using a signal flare. Nothing worked. Now I hear things in the cabin, whispers in the vents, soft, scratching behind the walls. Sometimes I see shadows in the corner of my vision, tall and thin, flickering just out of reach. And I think it's pretending to be Jared. Sometimes I hear footsteps, and when I check the other room, I catch a glimpse of him standing there, smiling. But it's not him. He doesn't blink. He doesn't breathe. Last night, he knocked on my bedroom door, just like the figure did on my window. He said, "It's warmer in here, isn't it?" I don't know how much longer I can stay awake. Every time I blink, he gets closer. Every time I sleep, I feel something touching my skin. And now the mirror in the hallway doesn't show my reflection anymore. It shows his. It was supposed to be a quick visit, a peaceful weekend with my aunt and uncle at their secluded cottage, buried deep in the forested hills. I hadn't seen them in years, and after the stress of my job and a recent breakup, the idea of silence, snow, and family comfort seemed like exactly what I needed. The day I arrived, a snowstorm was already creeping in. Thick flurries floated down steadily, covering the narrow road behind me as I parked. The cottage was quaint, old wooden beams, smoke curling from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowing through frosted windows. My aunt greeted me with her usual tight hug and the scent of cinnamon tea. My uncle, though, seemed different, quieter, distracted. His eyes kept flicking to the window. "We're glad you made it," my aunt said. "The storm's going to get worse tonight. Best you stay until it clears." That night, we had dinner by candlelight. The power flickered every few minutes, the wind rattling the walls like fists pounding to get in. I noticed something odd at dinner. Neither of them spoke about the storm. They didn't acknowledge it at all. Every time a gust hit the house or the lights dimmed, they simply carried on, smiling stiffly, changing the subject. When I brought it up, my uncle shot my aunt a look. She said, "Don't worry about the storm. Just don't look outside after dark." I thought she was joking, but when I glanced out the window after dinner, I understood. There were footprints, fresh ones, dozens of bare feet. I froze. "Someone's out there," I said, but my uncle grabbed my wrist gently but firmly. "No," he said, "don't acknowledge them. Don't open the door, no matter what you hear tonight." That's when I noticed something else. They'd boarded up the back windows, not for insulation, but to keep something from looking in. That night, I tried to sleep, but the house made it impossible. The wind screamed through the trees, and beneath it I heard tapping, faint at first, then louder. Then rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the window beside my bed. I lay still. I remembered what my aunt said. Don't look outside. Don't acknowledge them. But curiosity got the best of me. Slowly, I turned my head. There was a face staring in at me, pale, expressionless, its eyes dark pits. It had no eyebrows, no hair, just skin stretched taut over a skull-like face. And yet, it looked familiar, not like a stranger, like me, slightly distorted, but undeniably me. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the hallway, heart pounding. My uncle met me. He didn't ask what I saw. He just handed me a candle and said, "Stay where the light is. They hate light." I barely slept. In the morning, the footprints had multiplied. They circled the entire house. The snow was littered with bare, human feet, but impossibly long, with clawed toes and deep impressions like whoever made them was heavier than any person should be. I asked my aunt again what was happening, and she finally told me. This place, it's been cursed for years. Something lives in the snowstorms, something ancient. They take the shape of people. Sometimes people you know, sometimes they take your own face. I asked why they didn't leave. Because it follows. It doesn't haunt this place. It haunts you. I wanted to leave immediately, but the storm had made the road impassable. I was trapped. That night, the knocking came again. Harder, more urgent. I saw a shadow move past my window. Tall, thin, jerky. And then I heard my own voice outside the door. "Ah, let me in," it said. "Please, it's cold out here." I backed away. My aunt and uncle had locked themselves in their room. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking. Then came more voices, all of them in my voice, all saying different things. I forgot my key. I'm freezing. I need help. Why won't you let me in? I covered my ears. Sometime during the night, the power went out completely. I lit my candle, heart racing, and wandered toward the kitchen to find more matches. That's when I saw it, myself standing at the end of the hallway. But not just a reflection. It was me, shirtless, barefoot, soaked in melting snow, face emotionless. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, my aunt and uncle were gone. Their room was empty. Their clothes were still there. The window was open, frost curling along the sill, and only one set of bare footprints leading into the... That was 2 days ago. Now I'm alone. The house is silent, the storm unending. I've heard things in the walls, scratching, whispering, breathing that matches. Mirrors reflect faces, and tonight I saw something worse. One of the windows had fogged over from the cold. As I passed it, something had drawn a message in the condensation. 5 words. "You're not the real one?" And I realized something. I don't remember arriving. I don't remember driving here. I don't remember where I was before the cottage. What if I never came here? What if I've always been outside, trying to get in? What if the real me is already gone and I'm what's left behind? It started with a simple favor, house sitting for a friend of a friend. I didn't know the owners well, but they were offering good money to stay in their vacation cabin while they were overseas for a few weeks. The timing was perfect. I'd just quit my job, needed the solitude, and figured a little time away in a quiet mountain cabin during winter would be refreshing. The place was stunning, secluded in the woods, perched at the edge of a cliff overlooking a frozen lake. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only way in or out was a long, winding road that cut through the trees like a white ribbon. I arrived just before the snowstorm hit. The homeowners had left a detailed note, where to find extra firewood, how to operate the generator in case of a power outage, and a strange warning written at the bottom of the page: "Never leave the house after dark. No matter what you hear, do not open the door." I laughed when I read it, thinking it was some quirky local superstition, but that warning would soon haunt me. The first 2 days were uneventful, peaceful even. I cooked, read books by the fire, watched the snow fall. I spent hours just staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the lake, watching the trees sway and snow pile up. It was easy to forget the outside world, but on the third night, I heard it. A soft knock on the back door. It was gentle. 3 short taps, almost polite. I froze, unsure whether I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I peered outside, but the snow was falling so heavily I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch light's glow. I waited, heart pounding. After a while, the knocking stopped. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. They led from the woods straight to the back door. Bare feet, long toes, deep impressions like whatever made them had extra weight. And then I noticed something even worse. There were no return prints. Nothing walked away. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal? Maybe the snow had covered the rest of the prints. I tried to ignore the feeling that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. But the knocking came again that night, louder, longer. Then I heard a voice. It was hoarse, distant, but unmistakably human. "Please, let me in. I'm lost." I didn't move. I just sat in the dark, with the fire crackling beside me, trying to breathe. Then came another voice, this time clearer, closer. "Help me. I'm freezing. I don't know where I am," I called out. "Who's there?" but got no reply. Only the wind and snow swirling in the dark. When I gathered enough courage to peek through the curtain, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't moving. It didn't seem to be shivering. It just stood there, head slightly tilted, arms limp by its side, staring at the cabin, watching. I didn't sleep that night. The following day, I tried to call the homeowners, but the line was dead. My cell phone had no signal. I even attempted to leave, but the road was buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. I was trapped. The third night was worse. The figure came closer. This time, I saw its face. It was pale and expressionless, eyes hollow and black. But what shook me to my core was that the face looked almost like mine, as if it had borrowed features, but gotten them slightly wrong, like someone had described me from memory, and something had tried to reconstruct me. It didn't knock this time. It simply stood there, staring in through the window. I shut all the curtains, barricaded the doors, turned on every light I could. But even then, I felt its presence, like it was circling the house, waiting for. Around midnight, the power went out. The generator refused to start. The lights flickered and died. I lit candles and stayed by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife. Then I heard a voice again, only this time. It was my voice, identical, perfect, whispering through the cracks in the wall. "Let me in, please, I'm so cold." I held my breath. Tears rolled down my cheeks. "I know you hear me," it said, still using my voice. "You don't belong here." "I do," I screamed. I yelled for it to leave, but it didn't stop. The voice circled the house, whispering from every direction, taunting me, mimicking my own words back at me. "Help, please. I'm lost. I'm freezing." Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The front door creaking open. I ran to it with the knife, heart pounding. But it was still locked, still shut. Yet the voice was now inside. I turned and saw something standing in the hallway mirror. It was me, but wrong, taller, leaner, eyes too wide, skin too smooth. It smiled, and I saw rows of jagged teeth behind lips that weren't mine. The reflection didn't move when I did. It moved independently, tilting its head, mimicking gestures I hadn't made. I smashed the mirror. The shards scattered across the floor, but the image didn't vanish. I could still see it in every piece, grinning, closer than before. Since then, I haven't slept. The lights never came back on. I can feel it in the house now. Breathing, I breathe, following me from room to room, waiting. Yesterday, I found something terrifying on the floor by the back door. My own footprint, coming in from the outside. I don't know if I'm still the one inside this house, or if I'm just watching from the outside now, scratching at the walls, begging to be. And tonight, it's knocking, but I don't know which side of the door I'm on. It was supposed to be a quiet winter getaway, a chance to breathe, to reset, to finally be alone with my thoughts. After a long and draining breakup, my therapist suggested solitude, and a friend recommended an old cabin deep in the mountains. No better place to find peace, just you, the snow, and silence. At first, it was exactly that. The cabin was small but cozy. Wooden walls, a roaring fireplace, a massive window that overlooked an untouched stretch of white woods. I brought books, hot cocoa, and journals I hadn't opened in years. The snowstorm rolled in the night I arrived, sealing me in and blanketing everything outside. I wasn't worried. I had enough supplies, and the isolation felt like medicine until things changed. On the fourth night, I woke up suddenly, my heart hammering. The room was pitch black. The fire had gone out. I couldn't say what woke me, but something felt wrong, like the air had shifted, like something was watching. I turned on a flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing, just flickering shadows and the creaking of the wooden walls under the pressure of snow and wind. I calmed myself, thinking it was just a nightmare, but then I noticed something chilling. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it. I remember doing it twice. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly bolted it shut again. I told myself maybe I hadn't turned the latch all the way. Maybe the wind pushed it open a crack and it swung loose. But the next morning, I found a trail of wet footprints in the living room. Human, barefoot, melting snow tracked across the wooden floor, and they weren't mine. I was alone, or at least I was supposed to be. That day, I searched every inch of the cabin, under the bed, behind the kitchen cabinets, in the tiny storage crawl space beneath the floorboards. Nothing. No one. But that night, it happened again. The door. Unlocked. Footprints. Closer now, this time in the hallway leading to my bedroom. I stopped sleeping. I started carrying a kitchen knife. I lit every candle I could find. I even nailed boards across the doors and windows. But it didn't matter. Whatever was coming in didn't need doors. One night, I saw it for the first time. I was staring into the fireplace when the flames flickered strangely, casting shadows in unnatural shapes. And in the corner of the room, right where the candlelight dimmed, it appeared, only for a second, a hunched figure, naked and pale, crouching low with limbs too long for its body. Its head twitched sideways, like a marionette with a broken string. It made no sound, only a faint clicking noise, like fingernails tapping wood. Then it was gone. Just gone. I thought I'd imagined it, but the next morning, there were scratches across the floorboard, deep gouges leading up to where I'd been sitting, like something had crept inches from me, silently stared into the fire. The storm only worsened. I couldn't leave. The roads were gone. The trees were weighed down by thick sheets of snow, forming what felt like a barrier, a white prison. I tried to reach my friend on the radio she left behind. Static. Every time I tried to call for help, I'd hear whispers through the crackle, faint, indecipherable words that grew louder the longer I listened. Once, I thought I heard my own voice repeating, "You're not alone. You're not alone." Then came the laughter, soft, childlike, but wrong. It echoed from the corners of the cabin, from behind the walls, from inside the chimney. One night, the firewood wouldn't catch, no matter how hard I tried. The room grew colder, breath turning to mist, and that clicking sound returned. Closer this time. I spun around and saw it again, crawling along the ceiling, head backward, eyes gleaming in the dark. It dropped down silently, just a few feet from me. I screamed. I threw whatever I could at it, but it didn't react. It simply stared, its face expressionless, yet somehow filled with hatred. Then it melted into the floorboards like smoke. I don't know how many days passed after that. I lost time. I stopped eating. I heard voices, sometimes whispering through the vents, sometimes screaming behind the walls, and always, that clicking. Then, one morning, I found a letter on the kitchen table. The paper was yellowed, brittle, the ink smeared by water stain. But the message was clear. You let it in. I never wrote those words. I didn't leave the letter. But it was in my handwriting. Now, I see the figure in every reflection. Behind me in the window glass, in the shine of the kettle, even in the melting snow puddles on the floor. Always watching, never moving. And last night, it spoke. You're mine now. I tried to run this morning. I made it 10 feet into the woods before I collapsed, snow rising past my knees. I looked back and the cabin was gone. Just trees, endless trees. I'm writing this now from what's left of the cabin, or something that looks like it. But I think I've already left. I think something else is wearing my skin, living in my body, and waiting for the next person to arrive. If you find this, don't stay here. Don't trust the snow. Don't trust the silence. And whatever you do, don't open the door. It started with a knock. Not a gentle knock either. This was a pounding, heavy, urgent, like someone was trying to break the door in. I shot upright from my nap on the couch, startled and confused. It was nearly midnight, and the snowstorm outside was at its worst, the kind of storm that makes the world vanish in white. I remember squinting out the frosted window but seeing nothing, just wind and snow. Then the pounding came again. I should have ignored it. I should have just stayed in bed and chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on the old cabin. But something about it felt human, desperate, like someone was on the verge of death out there. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. There was nothing. No footprints in the snow, no figure in the darkness, just the wind howling through the trees and the storm roaring like it wanted to tear the world apart. But the sound had been real. I knew it. I stood there for a moment longer, confused, when I noticed something strange. Just past the edge of the porch, buried partially beneath the snow, was a small object. I stepped out into the cold and picked it up, a child's mitten. It was soaked, but still warm, and stitched into the inside of the cuff was a name, Ella. That was the first night. The next morning, I searched the woods. I told myself maybe a family had gotten stranded nearby. Maybe a child wandered. I didn't find anything. No one missing. No signs of life. I reported it to the ranger station, but I got static. The storm had knocked out most of the lines. That night, the knocking was louder, angrier. I didn't open the door. I didn't open. But when I woke the next morning, there were tiny handprints in the snow all over the porch. Dozens of them, child-sized. Some smudged, some fresh. And on the windows, I could see faint smears, like someone dragging their fingers down the glass while watching from outside. I started to panic. I tried to leave the cabin, but the snow had risen so high, my truck was completely buried. I was trapped. The third night, I heard giggling. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. But it wasn't just one voice, it was several, laughing softly from different directions around the house. Sometimes it sounded close, sometimes far. I stayed awake the entire night, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife, like they could protect me from whatever was out there. Around 3 a.m., I saw her for the first time, a small figure standing just beyond the tree line, a little girl in a tattered winter coat, missing one mitten. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, and she didn't move. She just stared at the cabin. I shouted to her, begged her to come inside if she was real, if she needed help, but she didn't react. She slowly turned and vanished into the trees without leaving a single footprint in the snow. After that, things spiraled fast. The next day, I found old newspaper clippings in the attic. I don't know why I even looked there, but it felt like something was calling me to. The articles were yellowed and brittle, some dating back decades. They told stories of missing children every winter in the same area, always during heavy snowstorms. 23 kids vanished without a trace. No suspects, no explanations. I saw their faces in the photographs, and I swear, one of them was the girl from the woods, Ella. That night, they came inside. I don't know how. I'd barricaded everything, but I woke up to the sound of footsteps, tiny, rapid, like a dozen children running barefoot across wooden floors. When I flicked on the lights, there was nothing, but things were different. Drawers were open, cabinets rattled on their own. Toys I never owned appeared scattered across the floor. Old wooden dolls, rusty jacks, a cracked music box that played by itself. I tried to burn them in the fireplace. The flames wouldn't catch. The air turned icy. My breath fogged out in front of me, even though the fire roared. And then I heard it again, giggling. This time, it came from behind me. When I turned, Ella was standing in the hallway. Only now her face was rotted and frostbitten, her lips twisted in a grotesque grin. Behind her stood the others, all 23, pale, ghostly children with hollow eyes, some missing limbs, others with mouths that never moved, but whispered all the same. They didn't attack me, they just watched. They followed me from room to room, silent, always watching. They'd vanish when I closed my eyes and return when I opened them. One night, I locked myself in the bathroom and found their handprints all over the mirror, inside and out. By the seventh night, I stopped trying to fight it. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I'd become a guest in my own body, wandering through the motions while these spirits, these forgotten children, lived alongside me. And now, I think they've chosen me, not to haunt, but to join them. Last night, I heard a new voice, whispering in the dark, a child's voice, gentle, warm. Come play forever. I woke this morning and found a new mitten beside my bed, not one of theirs, mine. I looked in the mirror and saw frost beginning to spread across my skin, like death had already started its slow crawl. I'm not writing this to ask for help. I know no one will make it up here. I'm writing this because maybe, just maybe, someone else will read it before they rent this cursed cabin. Maybe someone will understand the danger. They never found Ella or the others because they never left. They live here in the snow, in the cold, in the silence, between knocks on the door. And when the storm comes again, they'll be waiting for you. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a retreat into the stillness of the mountains to clear my head. My friend Jared had offered me his uncle's old hunting cabin tucked deep into the forest, miles away from civilization. No cell signal, no internet, just thick snow-covered woods and silence. It sounded perfect. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, got the fireplace going, and settled in. The wind howled outside, thick snow already layering the trees. It was beautiful in a desolate kind of way, peaceful even. But by nightfall, something felt off. I kept hearing a strange creaking noise from the attic. Not the kind a house makes when it settles. This was rhythmic, deliberate. I chalked it up to the wind and tried to ignore it, but it kept going, like footsteps pacing back and forth. When I finally decided to check it out, I found nothing. Just dust, cobwebs, and an old trunk shoved into the corner. I almost didn't open it. Inside were children's clothes, torn, faded, covered in dust, and old stains I didn't want to think too hard about. There were also toys, hand-carved wooden dolls, a cracked porcelain face, a stuffed rabbit missing an ear. But what really made my stomach twist was the notebook. It looked like a child had written it, scribbled pages filled with drawing, crude stick figures, angry black crayon scrawls, depictions of what looked like a man towering over a group of children. The last few pages were nothing but repeated phrases, over and over. He's in the attic. He watches us at night. Don't let him out. That night, the creaking returned. Only this time, it didn't stay in the attic. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a soft, dragging sound down the hallway. I froze. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I opened my door, there were faint marks in the dust along the floor, like something had been crawling. But there was nothing. I didn't sleep the next morning. The front door was wide open. Snow had piled into the cabin, the wind howling through the entryway. I swore I had locked it, deadbolt and all. I shut it again and pushed furniture in front of it. Something didn't want me, or worse, something wanted. I went into town that day, trying to get a signal, anyone I could talk to, but the storm had worsened. Roads were closing. I couldn't get a single bar on my phone, and by the time I made it halfway down the trail, a tree had fallen across the only road out. I was stuck. When I got back to the cabin, more things were out of place. My suitcase was emptied and clothes were strewn across the floor. The fireplace had gone cold, and the notebook, it was on the kitchen table, open to a page that hadn't been there before. In messy, childlike handwriting, "He's behind you." I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the kitchen, silent and still. But the air had changed. It was heavier, thicker, like the house was holding its breath. That night was the worst. I kept waking to sounds, soft whispers, heavy footsteps, the creak of the attic door opening on its own. I tried barricading myself in the bedroom, but the whispering started again. Not from the hall, from inside the room. I held my flashlight under the bed, trembling. There was a face staring back at me, pale, sunken, hollow eyes that didn't blink. I screamed and ran outside into the snow, barefoot, barely dressed. I didn't care. I sprinted toward the woods, but the snow was so thick I could barely move. Behind me, I heard something coming, lumbering, slow, dragging itself through the snow. Not running, just following. I eventually collapsed and passed out. When I woke up, it was morning, clear skies, but my footprints from the night before were gone, erased. I walked back to the cabin, half expecting it to be destroyed or gone, but it was just quiet again, untouched. But on the porch, nailed to the door, was the notebook. A new page, written in charcoal. "You let him out?" I don't know who he is. I don't know what I let out, but the cabin isn't safe anymore. And I don't think I brought that thing back with me when I finally got out of there. I think it followed me on its own, because now, even back in my apartment, I hear the attic creaking. I don't even have an attic. Every night now, I hear something crawling around above me, and the whispers are, I don't know how to stop it. I just know that the hunting cabin in those woods is no longer just an old property. It's a prison. The door is open. I was never fond of winter, but I tolerated it for the sake of my job. I worked as a tow truck driver for a remote mountain region, assisting stranded vehicles and responding to distress calls from drivers who underestimated the brutality of snowstorms. The work was long, lonely, and often dangerous, especially when I was dispatched alone during whiteout conditions. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night on Route 19. It started as a routine call. A car had skidded off the road near a narrow curve known for accidents, a stretch that locals ominously nicknamed Dead Man's Bend. The dispatcher gave me the coordinates, and I set off with my rig, my coffee still steaming in the cup holder. Snow was falling in thick sheets, visibility down to maybe 20 feet. Everything outside my windshield was a swirling mess of white. As I approached the bend, I spotted the car, an older sedan, nose down in a shallow ditch, its hazard lights blinking weakly. I pulled over carefully, set up my warning markers, and stepped out into the biting wind. The car was empty. The driver's side door was open, but no one was inside. I called out, expecting maybe the driver had walked up the road looking for help. No answer. I checked the surrounding area. Footprints led away from the vehicle and disappeared into the trees, swallowed quickly by the snowfall. Odd, but not unheard of. I radioed the dispatcher and told them the car was unoccupied and that I was prepping to tow it. That's when I noticed something strange about the sedan. The engine was still warm. There was an open purse on the passenger seat with a phone buzzing inside, a missed call, then another. The screen lit up with a message, "Mom, where are you? Call me." I shivered, not from the cold. Something didn't sit right. People don't just abandon their cars during a storm without trying to stay warm, especially when the engine is still running. Something had pulled her away. I turned toward the woods, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, fabric fluttering in the wind, a red scarf hanging from a low branch. I stepped toward it and saw more footprints, bare feet this time, smaller, like a woman's. But something was wrong. The impressions in the snow were far too deep, almost like she had been dragging her feet, or being dragged. The beam of my flashlight flickered as the wind howled louder. I called out again. That's when I heard the crying, faint and distant, but unmistakable. A woman's sobs echoing through the woods. I should have walked away, called it in, let search and rescue, but curiosity overrode common sense. I stepped deeper into the forest, following the sound. The deeper I went, the colder it felt. The trees seemed to grow thicker, branches leaning in like skeletal arms. The crying got louder, closer. I saw more signs now, torn pieces of clothing, blood drops staining the snow, scratch marks along the tree trunks. Then I found her. She was standing in the clearing, facing away from me, pale, barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her in the wind. Her shoulders were shaking from the sobs. I approached cautiously, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She didn't move. I stepped closer. "Do you need help?" Still nothing. I reached out, just as she turned around. Her face was a mess of frozen tears, cracked lips, and something else. Her eyes were wide and black, void of any iris or whites. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide as she shrieked, not like a human scream, but something guttural, ancient, predatory. I staggered back in horror as she lunged toward me. I turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I swear I could hear her behind me, those bare feet crunching against the snow, growing faster, closer. I barely made it back to my truck, slamming the door shut, just as something heavy hit the side. The whole rig shook. I turned the engine on, floored it, and didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway again. The next day, I reported everything. No one believed me, of course. The car was gone when they checked, as if it had never been there. No tracks, no scarf, nothing. Just a stretch of road covered in fresh snow. I took a few weeks off after that, but I kept thinking about what I saw, what I heard. I began asking around quietly, checking with older drivers and locals. One of them finally told me about an urban legend passed through the years, about a woman who had died decades ago in a crash on that exact curve. Her body was never recovered from the snow. Some say she wanders the woods during storms, crying for help. Others say she was taken by something inhuman, and now lures others toward it. Whatever the truth is, I know what I saw. I know what chased me through those woods, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting for another storm, another lost soul to follow the sound of crying into the trees. So, if you ever find yourself on Route 19 during a snowstorm and you hear sobbing in the woods, keep driving. Do not stop. Do not follow the sound, because it's not a woman who needs saving. It's something that wants you to come closer, so it can take you too. It was my second winter working the night shift at the Crestview Lodge, a quiet, upscale hotel nestled in the mountains, popular with tourists during snow season. I liked the solitude of the overnight hours. Guests were usually asleep by midnight, and I had the place mostly to myself. It was peaceful, or at least it used to be. I remember the night it all changed vividly. A blizzard had rolled in hard and fast. Most of the staff had already gone home early, and only a few guests were staying. I was alone at the front desk, sipping lukewarm coffee, and watching the snow pile up through the glass doors. The wind howled like a living thing, but inside, everything was still. Around 1:30 a.m., the phone rang. It startled me. Not many people called the front desk that late. I picked it up. "Front desk, how can I help you?" Static. Then a faint, whispery voice, "He's in the walls." I sat up straighter. "Excuse me? What room are you in?" No response. Just that same static and shallow breathing. I hung up, uneasy. I checked the guest list and noted that room 307 had requested a wake-up call earlier, so I decided to check in with them, just in case. I took the elevator up to the third floor. The hallway was dim, the overhead lights flickering slightly. I knocked on the door to 307. No answer. I knocked again, harder. "Hello? Front desk. Just checking in." Still nothing. I used the master key and opened the door. The room was empty. Perfectly made bed, no luggage, no signs anyone had ever been there. But the room had definitely been rented out. Our system showed someone had checked in earlier that afternoon. As I stepped farther inside, I noticed something peculiar. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the lodge. Much colder. I could see my breath, and then I heard it scratching. Soft, persistent scratching, coming from the walls. I backed out of the room and shut the door. I told myself it was rats, maybe a busted vent or faulty insulation. I tried to shake it off and return to the front desk, but I couldn't stop thinking about that. He's in the walls. About 20 minutes later, the lobby lights flickered, then went out. Total darkness. I reached for the flashlight in the drawer and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but the silence had become oppressive, like the whole building was holding its breath. I was making my way toward the breaker room in the basement when I noticed something on the wall near the elevator. It looked like a handprint, a smudged, wet handprint. Too high up for a child, but too small for a grown man. I leaned closer, and then I noticed there were more of them, dozens, all leading toward the stairwell. The power returned just as suddenly as it had gone out. I rushed back to the lobby, trying to convince myself I was overtired, seeing things. But the moment I stepped behind the front desk, the phone rang again. I hesitated, heart pounding, then picked it up. "They let him out," the voice whispered. Before I could respond, the call disconnected. That was it. I needed help. I picked up my radio and called maintenance, hoping someone was still on site. No answer. I checked the cameras. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the hallway outside, room 307, something was moving. Not walking, crawling. Something long and pale, unnaturally thin. It moved like it had too many joints. It crawled along the ceiling, then disappeared into the air vent. I froze. I didn't want to believe it. I rewound the footage, watched it again. It was real. Something was inside the walls. I ran to the security office to see if I could trace the creature's path. As I entered, I was hit by a foul stench, like rotting meat and mold. The room was trashed, monitors flickering, Something had been in there. On one of the screens, I saw room 212's door open slowly. That room was unoccupied. Then, a figure stepped out. It looked human, almost, but its skin was too pale, eyes sunken and hollow. It moved in jerky, unnatural ways, like a puppet with broken strings. I ran. I left the office, sprinted to the lobby, and grabbed my coat. I tried the front door. It wouldn't budge. It was like it had frozen shut from the outside. I grabbed the emergency radio and tried contacting local dispatch. Only static. Then the lights flickered again, and I heard it. The sound I'll never forget. A voice, not human, whispering through the vents. A chorus of whispers, all overlapping, repeating one phrase, "The lodge is his now." I took refuge in the laundry room in the basement, locking the door behind me. I stayed there the rest of the night, flashlight dying slowly, listening to the scratching in the pipes, the tapping on the walls. I didn't sleep. By morning, everything was normal. The lights were fine, the power was stable, the lodge was quiet. But when the day staff arrived and I showed them the footage, it was gone. Every file corrupted, nothing left but static. They told me I imagined, said stress and isolation during a snowstorm can mess with your head. But I know what I saw, and I'll never work another night shift again, because something is inside that lodge, and it's waiting. It was supposed to be a peaceful winter retreat. My partner Emily and I had been planning the trip for months, a cozy getaway to a secluded cabin in the mountains, away from everything and everyone. We both needed the break. City life had worn us down, and the idea of snow-covered trees, warm fires, and complete silence sounded like heaven. We arrived just before a snowstorm hit. The cabin was even more beautiful than expected. Rustic wood interiors, a big stone fireplace, and windows that looked out onto a blanket of white forest. The nearest town was 30 miles away, and the road to the cabin was already starting to get buried, but we didn't care. We had food, firewood, and each other. The first night was magical. Snow fell softly outside while we sat by the fire, sipping wine and listening to old records on the vintage player we found in the cabin's living room. It felt like we had stepped into another world. But the second night, things changed. It started with a noise, a thud, soft but distinct, like something heavy had landed on the roof. Emily paused mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, getting up to check outside. I didn't see anything, just the storm, raging harder than. The wind was howling through the trees, and snow swirled in thick sheets, reducing visibility to almost nothing. We tried to dismiss it. Maybe snow fell from a tree. Maybe an animal jumped onto the roof. But something about it unsettled me. Later that night, while Emily was asleep, I heard it again. Another thud, then a dragging sound, scraping across the roof like something was crawling. I crept to the window, pulled back the curtain, and stared into the blizzard. Nothing but darkness and snow. That's when I noticed something strange. Footprints, coming from the forest. Bare footprints in the snow. Not boot prints, bare feet. No shoes, no socks. Just pale, naked footprints, leading right up to our cabin. I leaned in closer, following their path with my eyes. They stopped right below the window, then disappeared. I rushed to the door and locked it. Every door, every window. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I didn't tell Emily. I didn't want to scare her. But by morning, I didn't have to say a word. She saw them too. The prints were still there, frozen in place, still barefoot, still leading right to our door, still no other signs of life. That's when we noticed something else. The footprints weren't from a normal-sized person. They were too long, with oddly spaced toes. They looked deformed, like whoever left them wasn't quite human. We stayed inside all day, hoping the storm would let up. But by nightfall, the wind had become violent. Trees bent, snow slammed against the walls, and the howling outside started to sound less like wind and more like voices, low, breathy whispers, like someone was just outside, speaking words we couldn't understand. Emily held my arm tightly. "I want to leave." I didn't blame her, but the road was impassable. Even if we tried to drive out, we'd get stuck. That night, we didn't sleep. We took turns staying awake, watching, listening. Around 3 a.m., something knocked on the door. Not a knock, really, more like scratching. Long, deliberate claws raking across the wood. We sat frozen. Then, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, moving around the cabin, scraping the windows, brushing against the walls. Then came the whisper again, only this time, it was clearer. "Let me in." We didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Then the voice shifted. "I see you." It came from the back window, and there, pressed against the glass, was a face, pale, gaunt, eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a grin that looked painful. Its breath fogged the window as it stared at us. Then it vanished. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, the prints were gone. No sign of the creature. We packed immediately. The storm was still raging, but we couldn't stay. We took our chances and drove. The snow nearly buried the car, but we made it, barely. When we got back to town, we told people what happened. They didn't look surprised. One old man at the gas station said something that still haunts me. "You stayed in the Whitlock cabin, didn't you? That thing's been wandering those woods since before my time. It only shows up in the snow. It's looking for warmth, looking for someone to let it in." I asked him what it was. He didn't answer, just shook his head and muttered, "If you ever hear it whisper again, don't open the door." We never went back to the mountains, but I still hear that voice sometimes, when it snows, whispering softly through the wind, "Let me in." The storm had already started by the time I reached the old highway that cut through the woods. I was heading to my cousin Nolan's house, a remote place deep in the snowy hills where he'd moved after some personal issues. We hadn't seen each other in years, but out of the blue, he called me, sounding shaken, desperate even. "I just need someone to talk to, man," he had said, his voice hoarse and low. "You'll understand when you get here." That was all he offered. No explanation, but something in his tone gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. So I packed a few things, jumped in my truck, and made the 3-hour drive through a snowstorm that only got worse the farther I went. His house was isolated, no neighbors for miles, surrounded by forest on all sides. When I finally arrived, the sky was dark, the snow falling in thick sheets, and the wind howled like it carried voices from somewhere unseen. The entire property was half buried under snow. Nolan's porch light flickered dimly in the storm. He greeted me at the door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He was thinner than I, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. There were scratches on his arms, and when I asked about them, he brushed it off. "Just the woods. Sometimes branches get me when I go outside." I tried to joke, tried to ease him into conversation, but he was distant, jumping at small sounds, checking the windows constantly. He barely touched his food. His dog, Max, a big German shepherd, refused to leave his side and growled constantly at the window. That first night, I barely slept. The wind was fierce, banging against the walls and rattling the windows. But it wasn't just the weather, it was the whispers. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Faint voices, low and disjointed, murmuring just outside the walls. I sat up in bed and strained to listen. It was too quiet to understand, but the cadence of it was wrong, like multiple voices speaking at once, but none. The next morning, Nolan looked worse than before. "You heard them, didn't you?" I didn't answer, but he already knew. "They come when it snows," he said. I think I brought them here." He told me it started weeks ago. He had been hiking in the woods just after a blizzard when he found something buried in the snow, a strange, twisted object, almost like a sculpture, made from wood and bone. He'd brought it home, thinking it was some kind of native artifact. The whispers began that night. "I burned it," he said, "but it didn't matter. I think they're inside the house now." That night, the whispers came back, louder, clearer. They didn't just whisper from outside anymore. They came from inside the walls. Max barked constantly, staring into the corners of the room, growling at shadows, and the lights began to flicker. The fireplace sputtered out, even though there was plenty of wood. And then the knocking started, soft at first, like a fingernail tapping on the wall behind the couch. Then louder, more insistent. The sound moved tap, 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 traveling from one wall to another, circling us. We tried to follow it, to figure out what part of the wall it came from. But every time we got close, it shifted again. Max suddenly ran to the basement door, barking violently. We opened it, and the dog charged down into the dark. Moments later, we heard a high-pitched yelp, followed by silence. We called for him. Nothing. I grabbed a flashlight, and we went down. The basement was freezing, our breath fogging in the air. We found Max cowering in the corner, trembling, whimpering like a wounded animal. He wouldn't go near the walls. That was when we saw it. Etched into the concrete foundation, symbols, dozens of, some carved deep into the stone, others drawn in what looked like ash or dried blood. I had no idea how they got there, but Nolan stared at them like he'd seen them before. I saw these in my dream. The next few days blurred into a cycle of fear and sleeplessness. Every time the snow thickened, the whispers got stronger. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. The temperature inside dropped, no matter how much wood we burned. Nolan started talking to things I couldn't see. He stopped eating, muttering nonsense under his breath, pacing back and forth like a man possessed. One night, I woke to find him standing outside in the storm, barefoot in the snow, staring up at the sky. I ran out to drag him back in, but when I touched him, his skin was burning hot despite the cold air. "They're calling me," he said. "They want me to come with them." I had no idea what he meant, but I knew I had to get him out of that house. The storm finally eased after a week. I packed what I could and forced Nolan into the truck. Max whimpered in the back seat the whole ride down the mountain. We stayed in a motel for a few nights in town. The first night there, Everything was calm. No whispers, no tapping, no shadows shifting on the walls. But on the second night, Nolan vanished. No broken door, no open window, just gone. His bed untouched, but the air in the room freezing cold. And scratched into the frost on the mirror was one word: returned. I don't know what I brought back with me. I still hear faint whispers when it snows. Sometimes Max growls at empty corners of the house. Sometimes I see those same symbols in my dreams. I don't know what Nolan found in them, but I think it wasn't just an object. I think it was a doorway, a calling, and something answered. It started as a simple winter retreat, a weekend escape with my fiancée, Clara, to a cabin her family owned deep in the snow-covered mountains. I'd always preferred the city, but Clara promised the trip would be peaceful. No distractions, just the two of us in the snow, she had said, smiling that warm, carefree smile of hers. I agreed, thinking a little isolation might actually be good for us. I had no idea what kind of isolation she truly meant. The drive was long, winding, and completely silent, except for the tires crunching over the snow-covered road. The storm had started just after we passed the last gas station, and by the time we reached the cabin, we were already half blind in a wall of white. The place was quaint, wooden, old, but well kept. It sat surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to close in around us the second we stepped out of the truck. The snowstorm had worsened, and we were nearly frozen by the time we got inside. Clara lit a fire, and soon the place felt warm and cozy. But the warmth didn't stop that strange feeling, like something was watching us from outside. That first night, we settled in easily enough. We ate, played cards, and talked by the fire. But just as I started to feel relaxed, Clara said something that chilled me in a way the cold never could. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I paused, listening. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, something like footsteps crunching in the snow just outside the cabin. I stood up and checked the window. Nothing, just darkness and snow blowing against the glass. It's probably just the wind. But that night, I dreamed of someone standing at the window, face obscured by frost and shadow, tapping slowly on the glass. When I woke up, I thought it was just a nightmare, until I saw the faint, wet imprint of a hand on the window pane beside the bed. I tried to brush it off, maybe condensation, maybe I'd imagined it. Clara didn't say much, but I could tell she didn't believe it was just a dream either. She kept glancing at the windows all morning. The storm had grown worse, making it impossible to leave. Snow had swallowed the truck wheels. Even stepping off the porch was dangerous, the snow nearly waist deep. So we stayed inside, trying to ignore the rising tension. That afternoon, we heard the first knock. It wasn't at the front door or the windows. It came from inside the walls, a soft, steady tapping from somewhere behind the bookshelf in the living room. I pulled the shelf away, expecting maybe a mouse or old pipe noises. But what I found was a hollow section of wall, a narrow opening leading into a tight crawl space. The strange part was, I didn't remember seeing it on the floor plan Clara showed me. We argued about going in. Clara begged me not to. She said her grandfather always warned her not to mess with that part of the cabin, that it was sealed for a reason. But curiosity won. I crawled inside, flashlight in hand. The space was cramped, the ceiling barely high enough for me to move. The air smelled damp and old, like dirt and mildew. I followed the narrow corridor until it opened into a small hidden room carved beneath the cabin. The walls were covered in writing, hundreds of words and phrases scratched into the wood. Some were in English, others I didn't recognize at all. There were symbols, too, strange, circular markings with crude figures and jagged spirals. At the center of the room was a small wooden box, rotted and locked tight. I left it alone and backed out, but something about the room stayed with me. That night, the knocking came again, louder now and closer. And then came the voices, faint whispers echoing through the walls, just like the ones I thought I'd heard the first night. Clara started crying in the middle of the night, saying she saw her grandfather standing outside the cabin, staring at her through, except he'd been dead for over 5 years. She said he mouthed something she couldn't quite understand. The next day, I couldn't resist it. I went back into the crawl space and pried open the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a crude figurine made of twigs and teeth, human teeth. Something inside me screamed to put it back, but I'd already touched it, already disturbed whatever was resting with it. That night, the cabin came alive with sound, thumps, scraping, dragging noises from within the walls. The fireplace went cold, the lights flickered, and shadows moved on their own. Clara screamed when she saw a figure standing at the foot of our bed, a tall, skeletal thing with antlers and hollow eyes. It didn't move. It just watched us until it slowly disappeared into the corner of the room. We tried to leave the next morning, but the truck wouldn't start. Snow had buried the tires completely. We tried walking, but something followed us through the woods, crunching footsteps just behind, though nothing was ever visible when we turned around. We returned to the cabin, defeated and terrified. That night, I woke to find Clara gone. I searched the entire cabin, shouting her name until my voice broke. I found the crawl space open again, the figurine gone. The walls in the hidden room were now freshly etched, new symbols, new phrases, and Clara's name. I don't remember how I got out. I just ran into the storm, blindly, until I collapsed from exhaustion. A rescue team found me 2 days later, frostbitten and delirious. No trace of Clara was ever found. They say I was hallucinating, that she must have wandered off in the storm and gotten lost. But I know what I saw. I know something ancient lives beneath that cabin, something that watches from the walls, something that speaks in whispers and lures people into the snow. Sometimes, when it snows hard, I hear her voice calling me back, begging me to return. It's been nearly 6 years since I left my hometown, and I swore I'd never go back, not even for my father's funeral. But when the letter came, handwritten and sealed in his familiar red wax, something inside me shifted. It wasn't guilt that brought me back. It was the single sentence at the bottom of the letter, written in his old, cryptic handwriting, "They still come when it snows." I thought it was a joke, or perhaps one last cruel jab from a man who never showed me kindness. But once I arrived back in that small, dead-end mountain town, I knew the letter had been more than a warning. It was a confession. The house was exactly as I remembered it, dilapidated, leaning, half-eaten by moss and frost, with warped floorboards and a stench of old pine and damp stone. The snow had begun falling hard by the time I stepped inside, and within an hour, the storm had sealed the roads behind me. Typical. That first night was silent, eerily. The wind didn't howl, and even the ancient wooden beams of the house didn't groan as they used to. I sat in my father's old chair, reading through the rest of his journals. Most of it was rambling nonsense, scratched notes about shadows in the woods, whispers in the snow, and eyes watching from the treetops. But one entry stood out, dated almost 30 years ago. They come from the drift behind the well. When the wind dies and the snow thickens, they slither beneath the crust of ice. They don't walk, they don't leave tracks, but they knock, always 3 times, before they take someone. That night, I barely slept, not because I believed the stories, but because part of me started to remember something I'd buried long ago. When I was 7 years old, I woke one night to find my sister staring out the window, crying. She told me someone was knocking on the glass. I remember the snow was thick that night, so thick our dog froze to death trying to get back inside after just a few minutes outside. My sister disappeared that same night. They said she ran off. They said she must have gotten lost in the storm. But I remembered those knocks, 3 of them, hollow, slow, deliberate. The second night, the storm intensified. I lost power by late evening and the house was swallowed in blackness. I lit candles and sat in silence, reading more of the journal. He wrote about ritual, about offerings he'd made. Small things at first, bird bones, deer blood, then bigger things. I heard the first knock around 2 a.m., 3 soft thuds against the front door. I froze, my body locked in place. I don't know why, but I didn't move toward the door. I waited, holding my breath. Then the second knock came, at the kitchen window, and the third, directly behind me, at the back door. I never opened any of them. I sat still, eyes shut, hoping the knocks would stop, but something began scratching the walls next. It moved in long circles around the house, dragging something hard and sharp against the wood. By morning, the snow had sealed the doors shut and I had no choice but to stay inside. That day, I dug through the basement, looking for answers, anything, and I found something I hadn't seen since I was a child. Beneath a loose stone under the stairs was a bundle of old, rotted cloth, wrapped around what looked like a jawbone, human, small, like a child. It was hers, my sister's, and suddenly, everything came rushing back. The night she disappeared, I'd seen my father standing outside in the snow, holding her hand, whispering something to her. He'd led her to the edge of the woods, where the trees grew too thick and the snow fell too quietly. I never saw her again. He never spoke of it. The final entry in his journal confirmed it. 1 for each decade, 1 offering to keep the house safe. My blood, my debt. They'll come for me next. I can't keep feeding them. The storm didn't stop the third night. It got worse, and the knocks returned, 3 times again and again, circling the house like a ritual. I boarded the windows. I burned the journal. I tried to bury the jawbone, but the earth was too frozen. That night, I saw them. Not clearly, only their shapes in the snow, twisted and too long, slithering under the snowdrift, just as the journal described. Their eyes weren't visible, but I felt them, piercing me from beyond the veil of falling snow. They didn't speak, but they breathed against the window, left icy trails wherever they passed. By the 5th night, I'd lost all sense of time. The house felt smaller, colder. I could hear something breathing under the floorboard. And then it happened. A knock, but not at the door this time. from inside the attic. I hadn't touched the attic since I arrived. It had always been locked, sealed with rusty chains, but the door was wide open now. Behind it was only darkness. I climbed the stairs slowly, candle in hand, the flame flickering with every step. The air was thick, metallic, and when I opened the attic door fully, I saw the truth. The walls were lined with small figurines, twisted shapes made from bone, hair, and cloth. There were dozens of them, each one representing a year, a person, a sacrifice. And in the far corner of the attic stood my sister, or something that wore her face. She was taller now, her skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. Her eyes were black hollows, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. She pointed at me, and behind her I saw them, the figures from the snow, crawling toward me in twitching, jerky motion. They didn't run. They didn't roar. They simply advanced, slow and inevitable. I slammed the attic door and fled the house. I don't remember how I made it through the storm. Somehow, I woke up in a hospital in a neighboring town, found by a snowplow crew on the side of the road. They said I was nearly frozen to death. No one believed my story. The house has since been demolished, or so they say, but I know better. They're still out there, beneath the snow, waiting for the next storm, the next offering. And some nights, when it snows heavily where I live now, I hear 3 soft knocks at my door, and I don't dare answer.